Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Benatar. I am currently an experiential designer at CannonDesign based in Philadelphia. Today, I will be presenting my research study, Unexpected Beauty, a case study in empathy-driven spatial design. This was a project I originally completed in my last role as an experiential designer at Interior Architects through their Spark Innovation Fellowship. While I'm no longer with the team at IA, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to continue exploring this topic in more depth, and of course, to get to share with you all today. Before we dive in, I wanted to start us off with this quote from healthcare researcher and physician Dr. Prabjot Singh. He says, "We spend a lot of time designing the bridge, but not enough time thinking about the people who are crossing it." At its core, I think that's what this project is really about. How do we slow down our typical design process to ensure that we're really considering people first and foremost? At a high level, the purpose of the study is to explore the unexpected beauty that can come out of a space that's designed with empathy at the forefront. When coming up with the initial proposal for this project, I was really interested in exploring what happens when you temporarily eliminate the specific industry of the space we're designing for, and instead reframe it solely through the lens of the visitors that will be walking through the space. We typically start a design process by asking, what is the context? But what if we started with who is our context instead? This question is what initially piqued my curiosity, and it will really serve as the through thread for everything I'll be sharing today. As a further look into this question, I chose to ground my research in a real-life case study. I came across an incredible organization early on in my process called Maggie's Centers. Maggie's is a conglomerate of 31 cancer centers, primarily located across the UK, that offer completely free of charge cancer support services to anyone that walks through their doors. These are not treatment centers. In fact, they pride themselves in being the antithesis to a hospital environment. Rather, they offer a wide range of therapeutic services, financial advising, social support groups, and most importantly, they offer patients and family members an incredible community and a beautiful space to recharge and gain the courage they need to face their new realities. As a part of the Spark Fellowship, I had the incredible opportunity to visit 3 different Maggie centers in order to experience the environments they've created and hear firsthand from staff members. Before getting into my site visits, I wanted to quickly define a term that I'll be using throughout this presentation, which is empathetic design. There are many definitions out there, but in short, they all point back to empathetic design being a branch of human-centered design that combines observation of human behavior with subjective interpretations of human experience. A study I found early on framed it as essentially striking the balance between emotionally empathizing with someone else's experience and then stepping back to analyze it. There are many reasons that empathetic design is important, but at a high level, we want to use empathetic design to challenge our assumptions and biases, to gain a deep understanding of the problems and realities of the people you're designing for, and understand that what people mean is often different than what they say. Similarly, there are also many ways that people have proposed implementing empathetic design, but I pulled out just one framework I found especially interesting. This study by Cooper and Weiser broke down empathetic design into these 4 stages: discovery, immersion, connection, and detachment. If we focus on that last stage of detachment for a second, it really speaks back to the balance I mentioned between empathizing with an experience and then detaching, being able to analyze it, and in our case, transform it through design. But with all of that context in mind, let's dive a little deeper into Maggie's Centers. Maggie's was founded in the late 90s by a woman named Maggie Keswick-Jenks, who was a writer, gardener, and designer. Maggie's own battle with cancer and her experience in many windowless hospital corridors, as she describes, inspired her to rethink cancer care altogether. She, along with her husband, created the blueprint for the first center in Edinburgh shortly before her death. So unfortunately, she was never able to see the opening of that first center, but her ideas and her legacy have since been realized and carried on by her family. I think this quote from Maggie's manifesto perfectly describes the mission and purpose that drives Maggie Centers. She said, above all, what matters is not to lose the joy of living in the fear of dying. This is really something that comes through at each center. They are places for people that are experiencing a lot of pain. They're not sad places. They're actually quite joyous. And I think that speaks very highly of their strong design philosophy, which we'll get into next. In order to truly bring this vision into reality, all of Maggie's centers actually follow the same design brief that was developed by Maggie's family. And as soon as I first came across this brief, I knew that it would become a very central part of my project. What is incredibly unique about this document is that the aesthetics play no part in it, and even functional space requirements are only a secondary part of the brief. The majority of the document is actually centered around the feelings that each space and subspace needs to elicit. The spaces delineated in the brief are given a lot of human attributes: calm, friendly, unintimidating, to name a few. And they also hold a lot of nuance. For example, the brief talks about spaces that feel calm and safe, but also bold and joyous, appropriate, but also surprising. As I move into my center visits, you'll really be able to see how this design brief comes to life in the physical spaces. As I mentioned earlier, I set out to visit 3 Maggie centers, and I chose 3 in particular: Bart's in London, Royal Marsden in Sutton, England, and Fundació Kālida in Barcelona, to analyze Maggie's through 3 fairly different lenses. So starting off, my first site visit was to Maggie's Bart's in the heart of London. Bart sits on the grounds of the oldest hospital in all of England. It's actually 900 years old. And the design of the center by Stephen Hall Architects was actually directly inspired by the music that comes into the space from the iconic Great St. Bart's Church, which is just across the street. And to me, this is just one example of how carefully that historical context was considered and celebrated through the design of this center. Another thing that really struck me as soon as I walked in was that this space pretty immediately allows people to open up and be vulnerable in a way that's very contrasting to a hospital setting, which forces you to have your guard up. Along those lines, I was also surprised by how personal the experience of visiting a Maggie Center feels. I think given the hospital setting that I was used to, I expected a certain level of anonymity when a new person walks into the center, but what I found was really the opposite. Each person that walks into a Maggie Center, new or returning, is greeted and shown to the kitchen where they can pour themselves a cup of tea or coffee. And it sounds simple, but what that first impression does is it creates an environment where people can immediately be comfortable in, rather than hiding or shying away from the very scary reality that patients are facing. The personal, home-like environment pushes them to talk about it and to confront it. The last thing that surprised me was how lively and joyous the environment is at the center. I was lucky enough to get to spend the whole morning there, where I got to see how the center fills up over the course of the day, and you hear visitors exchanging stories, laughing together, and intermittently joining the various activities the center offers. It feels strange to say that a cancer center feels joyous, but I think it speaks volumes to the Maggie's design philosophy, which we'll continue to see throughout the visits. In my next part of the trip, I took the train down to Sutton, England to visit Maggie's Royal Marsden Center. And despite the fact that this one is in a pretty remote area, the location is one of the busiest of all of the Maggie centers, seeing around 130 visitors a day. This is pretty mind-blowing when you think about how personal and individualized the experience is for each and every person that comes into the center. Something that struck me during my interview with Charmaine, a cancer support specialist, is that the space is not only designed to have home-like features, but to instinctively feel like a home. The fact that you can see the kitchen table as soon as you enter, and that you can help yourself to coffee or tea, these things instinctively trigger feelings of comfort and familiarity. I love this quote from Charmaine. We often underestimate that the building itself is just as much of a support to visitors as the services we offer. What she meant by this is that we should not underestimate the power of being in a beautiful space. Many visitors come not to use any of the services offered, but just to be in a bright, calming, and familiar space. What initially drew me to this center in particular was the bold use of color. However, what I didn't know from my preliminary research was how intentional the use of color is in delineating the subspaces within the center. As you can see here, they have two large flexible lounge spaces, which they refer to as the green room and the yellow room, shown on the top left. The green room, Charmaine described, makes you feel very grounded and peaceful and gets more use as the day goes on, whereas the yellow room makes you feel more energized and alert and might get the most use in the mornings. Their private consultation rooms are a darker maroon color, which Charmaine described as akin to being in the womb. So you feel very warm, comforted, and cozy. And she also just mentioned in our conversation that these colored spaces might attract different visitors based on their personalities or even their mood that day. Another common feature within Maggie's centers is the open plan, which offers nooks that feel private but not isolating. So you can very much be alone, but still observing what else is happening around you. All of these features really speak back to that sense of flexibility and the choose your own adventure that is visiting a Maggie's center. And then lastly, my final site visit was to Fundació Kālida in Barcelona. Kālida is the first Maggie Center in Spain, and even though it was founded by the same organization and it follows the same philosophy, the name was changed to Kālida to feel more appropriate in Spanish and in Catalan. And something I didn't realize prior to being there is that the center is located on the same complex as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which used to be a complex of medieval hospitals and is now known as the Recinto Modernista. And as I learned in my interview with Kālida, who's pictured here, the original complex was founded on a charitable philanthropic philosophy, which actually makes it a very appropriate location for Spain's first Maggie Center. In addition to the name being changed, every design feature within this center really heavily leans into the Spanish and Mediterranean influence in a way that's made to feel very intentionally different or separate from the primarily British centers. As you can see in the photos, the center has a floating brick facade that blocks views from the exterior, but the space in between allows light to enter and allows the space to still feel very open. As I mentioned, there are tons of details in this space that truly celebrate Spanish architecture, from the exposed scalloped bricks in the traditional style of Bóveda Catalana to the decorative brazed blocks and ceramic tiles that are vaguely reminiscent of Moorish influence. Details like this allow locals to immediately feel welcome and represented in this space, and they also immediately set the space apart from the hospital where many patients are coming from. The garden in this space is also beautiful. It looks right out at the Art Nouveau style buildings of the Recinto Modernista, which I was also able to explore a bit after my site visit, and you can see that on the bottom right here. If I'm being honest, there were way too many takeaways from my visits to Maggie's to count, but I would like to expand upon just a few here that I think we as experiential designers can really appreciate. For starters, placemaking is key to Maggie centers. One of the ways that they create a strong sense of place is through the integration and celebration of the design story of each center. Throughout my interviews that were with cancer support specialists and center leads, the common thread was that all staff members could describe in great detail the design intent of their center. More often than not, if you asked a non-designer employee to tell you about the design of their office, they might not have that much to say. But this goes to show that when design is ingrained in the experience of a space, it is notable to everyone, not just designers. My second key takeaway for me was the power of emotion as a design tool. All three of my site visits really showed me an intangible quality that can only be achieved by truly considering feeling and emotion. Across all Maggie centers, each space is heavily linked to an emotion. This is where you can see the design brief that's truly realized. The brief tells us how each area should feel, but says nothing about how each space should look, which is how you end up with centers that look completely different, but trigger the same feelings when you walk in. Our instinct when moving full force into a project is often to dive right into the palette and the aesthetic direction, whereas Maggie's brief is again encouraging us to take a quick step back to first think about emotion and behavior, and then consider how the space can support those desired emotions. Lastly, autonomy is another key feature within Maggie centers that exemplify their empathetic design lens. Every moment in the experience is carefully designed to offer visitors choices. Some of these moments may feel inconsequential, but really no decision is too small when most other choices are out of your control, and unfortunately, this is often the case for cancer patients. Following my site visits and doing a comparative analysis of these three centers, I wanted to begin to apply these concepts of empathy-driven, emotion-led design into our everyday process through a simple exercise. This is by no means an all-encompassing solution, but rather a thought starter that we can use to start approaching design problems a little bit differently. I imagine this exercise being used at the very start of a project, either for internal brainstorming or for client-facing visioning sessions. And the central idea is to invert our typical design process to start with feeling and emotion and then see how the built environment can support those feelings, not unlike what the Maggie's design brief does. So what does this look like? For the sake of time, I'm going to illustrate an example using a single experience touch point, which we're going to use as collaborate. On the left, you'll see that before starting the exercise, you might want to first define that touch point with the team and the client. In this case, let's say we're designing a workplace, so we can really see how this might work in a context outside of healthcare. Alongside your client, you would first determine what does collaboration entail at X company, and what parts of collaboration are important to company culture. Once you've established some parameters together, you could move into step number 1. When people need to collaborate, they might be feeling blank. Here, one person might say nervous, one might say distracted, and another might say excited. It's important that we're being honest in this first step. Not all emotions will be positive or negative. We just want to try putting ourselves in the shoes of the user. Next, in step 2, we start to think about the desired emotions that we want to elicit through design. When people need to collaborate, we want them to feel blank. For instance, creative and supportive. At step 3, this is the point where we want to kind of step back from the touch point and connect that desired emotion back to our own lived experiences. In this example, think about the last time you felt creative and supportive. What were you doing? Where were you? A few examples I put down include an art critique in school, a jam session at a local bar, sharing writing with friends. Then in the next step, you would pick one of those experiences to dissect a bit further. For instance, if I think back to my experiences with art critiques in school, some of the characteristics of that environment that come to mind are there has to be a space to be a bit messy, there were always many different types of workable surfaces, so on and so forth. These are obviously just a few examples, but the idea here would be to start a brainstorm as a group and fill in as many as possible. Finally, in the last step, step 5, we want to try to connect these characteristics back to our original touch point, which is what's going to help us start to build out a desired journey map, which you'll see on the next slide. Here, you would want to consider as a team, can these same considerations that we listed become some of the experience drivers for the collaborative spaces we create? Ideally, this would prompt some discussion and maybe you refine these considerations further, or maybe it sparks some new ones to add. Once you've solidified these drivers, you can infill them into this desired experience roadmap, and then you can repeat the process for as many touch points as you want. What I think has a lot of potential with this approach is that you're really creating a visual summary page that brings together experience, feeling, and some design thought starters just from a very simple exercise. This is an exercise I hope to continue testing for efficacy and developing further to eventually become a part of a greater emotion-based design toolkit. To wrap up my presentation, I want to leave you with a few points that I think we can glean from Maggie's centers and their design brief. Number 1, bringing an empathetic design lens into our process can help us reach the end users we often don't have access to. and to ensure that we are striving to understand their motivations and behaviors within the spaces we design. Number two, considering emotion can provide us with a different starting point for a project. Again, it helps us take a step back for a second to understand the ask before designing. Number three, along those lines, it's easy to overlook emotion because it doesn't always feel very concrete. But scientific research actually shows that our brain constructs emotion to guide our behavior. We can't really design meaningful spaces without considering behavior. So therefore, you also can't design meaningful spaces without considering emotion. Maggie Centers certainly provided me with a new perspective on designing experiences that put people's needs above all else. And it's an honor to get to share that with you all today. So lastly, I just wanted to thank all of my amazing mentors for their support throughout this project, as well as Maggie's Centers, and of course, IA and SEGD for this incredible opportunity. And thank you to my dad, who recently lost his own battle to cancer, for inspiring me to be curious and brave and never stop learning. Thank you all.